I do, to a certain degree, agree that if you're a Democrat, you're dug in for Obama, and there's not going to be a lot of wiggle room. If you're a Republican, you're probably more likely to vote for Romney, of course, than anything else. I will say that I think the number of disaffected voters across the board is much, much higher, because I think the partisanship and the polarization, and specifically the anger and anxiety at Washington and its ineptness and its inability to get anything done, and its incredible partisan gridlock, where we've seen a Congress that is truly has been a do-nothing Congress. When I think that those feelings of frustration are so strong that I would expect to see crossover voters. I'm not going to say in a pretty big numbers, but I do think the crossover voters this time will be fascinating, because I think there are a lot of Democrats who are disillusioned by the president and holding their nose and voting for him anyway. And I do think that the Republican Party, with the ideological splits going on in the party between the Tea Party and the more pragmatists in the party, you're going to see some disillusioned voters who are going to waver or frankly stay home.
And I think that's the key thing too, is voters who are not going to come out, and so I wonder, what is it going to take for each party to really try to get that key base out, because that is an issue. I mean, I don't think Obama's going to see the numbers that he saw in 2008.
Look, voter suppression happens all the time, and it is hard to detect, but both sides will try to do two things. They will try to fire up their own base by talking about red meat issues that get their base going. They will also work below the surface to suppress the vote, and that means running ads on black radio. That means flyers on car windows and church parking lots. This kind of stuff happens all the time. I think the challenge for all of you, just like the challenge for all of us, is how do we cover that? It is the most difficult thing to cover is voter suppression and voter suppression efforts, and I think it's real, and I think it's I think we're going to see it in an even more profound way this year than perhaps ever before, because both sides recognize it is going to come down to turnout in a lot of these places.
Well, we're really seeing some serious issues come up in Florida in terms of.
Yeah, I think you talked about it yesterday, but there's so many lawsuits out there in these states that, I don't know, election day the fight might again end up in the courtroom, because there'll be challenges on provisional ballots, the absentee ballots. We have several lawsuits ongoing in the state of Florida, and I know there's going to be lawyers lined up. They've already told us they're going to be lined up on election day to challenge any problems that happen. I was just going to say one thing about the undecided. We were having a poll that the Herald does with our partners at the Tampa Bay Times, and I can't tell you all the polls because it's embargoed until Sunday, but I will tell you this little nugget is only 4% of the voters in the presidential race in Florida, only 4% are actually undecided. And the feeling that our pollster told us yesterday was that undecided, like Liz is saying, may not even show up at the polls anyway. We might as well fold up the tent now and just have the election tomorrow, but because there's so few people out there that haven't, that are still just I mean, it's decided already, but that group is very small that's still thinking about it.
Well, some of the access to the polls issues that Liz was talking about are certainly playing out in Ohio, and it's another thing that's really been ongoing for most of the last 2 years. When Republicans took most spots in the State House in 2010, they came in 2011 and really tried to change basically the rules for voting in the state, and a lot of those changes passed, but then were challenged both in court and through referendum, and now we're in a situation where there are at least 3 major lawsuits ongoing. One filed by the president's campaign himself to restore in-person early voting the final 3 days before the election. which makes a big difference. Their numbers show just I don't know, almost 100,000 votes I think were cast in person those last 3 days. I don't remember the exact number. There's also an issue about how provisional ballots are counted. And then there's actually a very conservative group that has filed a lawsuit against the Republican Secretary of State for failing to, quote, clean up the voting rolls. In some counties there are more registered voters than eligible voters, which we've all done reporting on this. We all know that actual instances of voter fraud are very low. But the simple fact that there are more registered voters than eligible voters in some counties at least raises the question, what's going on or what could go on.
So in keeping with the theme of the day, which is Social Media Friday, I wanted to ask you, and I think it's going to be a good conversation because there's probably different views on this on the panel. But I want to start by asking you about the ways in which each of the candidates are using social media this go around, and what impact that's having on the campaigns. And I'll start with you, and then we'll talk about how you use it in your own reporting. And but I want to kind of get a sense of what you're seeing from the camps.
Well, Twitter is a brilliant thing. It's a great thing and it's a bad thing. It's a great thing because people and politicians say some really stupid things on Twitter. And it's a bad thing because, unfortunately, we as journalists are people too. So we say some dumb things sometimes, and we have to watch. But you really see both campaigns using Twitter and Facebook. But I'm going to focus my comments on Twitter. You see them both, and you really see them try to drive a certain message or a certain narrative, and it really happens on both sides. Just taking, for example. We'll take the 47% issue that came up from Governor Romney recently. Obviously, Democrats just driving that message and their take on it on Twitter over and over again. And you see lots of Republicans saying on Twitter, well, why is the mainstream media focusing on this when Libya is burning? It's kind of a way to distract what people are talking about. But you can see, and I know you want me to talk about this. You can actually see campaigns try to drive a message. And here's an example. I was telling you all earlier about this, about President Obama's lawsuit in the state, which, as I said, was filed to restore in-person voting the final 3 days before the election. But what the lawsuit was compared to was that military personnel, overseas military personnel, is allowed to vote those final 3 days. And so the lawsuit says the rest of the voters should get that too. And the Romney campaign took that lawsuit and on Twitter and other social media sites began to say that the president was seeking to take away those rights from military voters, which, as we all know in this room, would be a huge hot-button political issue. And it was factually, it was not true. And you could watch this over a Friday night and Saturday, it growing on Twitter with some of Romney's top campaign spokesmen and surrogates saying this, tweeting it, linking to some stories from some news outlets that were going along with that narrative. And it didn't stop until a few independent reporters said on Twitter, "This is not true. The Romneys are intentionally misleading you on this issue." And when that started to happen, they stopped and tried to change how they were spinning this lawsuit, and it went on from there. It turned into a couple of newspaper stories for us, but that is a very clear example of how you can use social media in a campaign.
Does anybody else want to jump in?
Oh my gosh, I could write a book on it. In fact, I might. The campaigns have figured out a way to use social media to influence the narrative of campaigns writ large, and they're taking advantage of the angst in our industry and in the changes in technology, and they're manipulating us, and they're manipulating the story by recognizing that we have fewer reporters who have less time covering them and the campaigns, and that we all look at Twitter for clues as to, you know, what the story is, where the story is going. And so they have recognized that they can manipulate us through Twitter, through social networking, by making something very small seem very big. I think it's important context to, you know, important to keep in mind that most of America is not on Twitter. Reporters are on Twitter. So when the campaigns use Twitter and use Facebook, they're talking to us and trying to influence what we write, and they're not speaking to voters. You know, I think on our side, on the reporting side, the way we do it at the AP and our policy is we encourage robust use of social networking to promote our own material, promote our stories that we write, and as a news tip service. You know, again, this goes back to the dangers of social networking and social media, which is a lack of standards. You can put anything on there, regardless of whether or not it's true, and the idea that anybody can be a reporter and a publisher without those standards. And where I think it's problematic for journalists is when you move from using it as a news gathering source that you then you know, trust and verify. You know, you take that information and you follow the story and then you verify it and then you write your story. Instead of using it that way, when you start to use it to opine, I think is where it becomes a problem. There's also a groupthink issue that, you know, what happens on Twitter isn't necessarily what's going on in the real world. And the one example I'll give you is last week with foreign policy and Romney's misstep and premature attack on the president before anyone knew that a U.S. ambassador had died in Libya. If you watch Twitter, the narrative among those of us like me and Chuck who get up on TV and talk about things on politics, the narrative on Twitter was, oh my gosh, this was a horrible mistake for you know, Romney and that kind of thing. And we were all talking to ourselves. But when you looked in the newspapers, and you looked in the Columbus Dispatch, and you guys were talking about the economy last week. You know, there's a disconnect between who is on Twitter and who's talking about these things versus what real people in battleground states are talking about.
I was going to say, that's a very, very good point, because it happened to us last night. You know, Romney and Obama were in Miami to talk to Univision, and the storyline we had yesterday, which our political reporter is very astute, was simply that, you know, the president got grilled by Jorge Ramos on a very key question, that Obama broke his promise on immigration, and he hammered him on it. Okay, we got the story written, done, edited, and sent, and I was going to go to Margaritaville because my boss told me to.
Exactly, yeah.
But then I get a message from my political reporter, hey, there's a lot of chatter about the fact that Obama said he can't change Washington. You know, that whole, which to our readers, no one would give a hoot, really. The immigration question was a big one, and it was a very dramatic moment where Ramos just pounded Obama on the question. It was actually a very, very, very good for usually what's a boring candidates forum where they have their talking points. But you know, he felt, and we felt compelled, well, okay, we'll add that up higher in the story. We kind of changed it just on what you're thinking of, the group think of like, okay, we might as well get it in there because we're going to look stupid that everyone else is talking about it and we're not. And that's where it does affect the way you even, you know, report the story. Well, you should say after you've written the story, but also the way it gets edited, that you are aware of everyone else because of Twitter and because of it's just a loud, it's someone yelling in the room and it gets closer and closer and closer and you feel like, okay, I got to respond to this.
Well, and yesterday was a great example of how the Romney campaign used social media to manipulate that situation, because before I went over to Margaritaville, I was fielding phone calls from the Romney campaign screaming at me, why is the AP not covering this news? Why? I mean, this is a big deal. He said he wasn't able to change Washington, and you know, Romney goes out on that stump and he attacks on that issue, and so the Romney campaign thinks it should be a news issue. So what do? they turn to all their conservative allies in the Twitterverse, and they tell them, you know, go attack the president on this. You know, point out that the AP didn't, you know, point out that the AP didn't cover this. Point out that the Miami Herald's not leading with this. This is what the story should be. This is what the story. And so then everything gets riled up. And look, we're all who report on politics or engage in politics and do Twitter. We're a very minute slice of America, but it's provided a megaphone, and it's like, how do you put the genie back in the bottle after it's out of the bottle? I don't know.
But still, at the end of the day, we're still the reporters and editors, and definitely the social media, and really starting with, you know, the internet some time ago, and cable TV and all this, as you all very well know, sped up the news cycles, and we have to live with that. There's no undoing that. But at the same time, I guess I take slight issue with what Liz has said. They try to manipulate us, but you know, it's up to us when you're getting flooded with. You know, I mean, it hasn't changed that much. You know, years ago, before Twitter, campaigns would yell and scream at you to try to influence what you do, and you have to use your own judgment as a news person to say, I think you've got a good point, or you don't have a valid point. That's their job, is to win elections. Their job is not to put reasonable news out in front of the customers. That's our job. And really, I think at the end of the day, what Twitter and the social media has done is, you're right, it is louder. They're screaming at us louder. They're screaming at us faster. But it's still our job to stop, wait, let's think this through, and is this a valid point or not a valid point?
It's one more factor. I think maybe that's the way to look at it too. And yeah, Chuck, I totally agree with you. But it's one more factor in all those reporting. It's a reporting tool, and one more factor we have to consider as we do what I think none of us collectively do enough, which is fit those tidbits of American political journalism or any journalism together and say, this is what happened, this is why it matters, and you know, this is why you should care about it. And so it's, you know, feeding this notion of tidbit journalism and, you know, stories told in 140 characters. And I think it's our job not just to have that high bar that Chuck is talking about, but to look at that as, you know, one factor in the larger story, and how do you fit the pieces together to tell the larger story.
I do think all these things are good. I think this is all good for us. I think it's good for the country. I think it's good for reporters, because if you are going to do your job, kind of like Chuck was talking, it makes you almost do it better, because you know that there's a certain degree of manipulation going on, and there's a certain degree of, there's only so much truth you can get out in 140 characters. And so it certainly has made me, I guess, focus even more on what, you know, what the story really is, and really getting into, you know, the actual facts of something for a story. And I also just know that more readers are looking at what I write because of Twitter than at any time. I mean, you know, of course the internet's been around for a long time, and people in California have always been able to read things in the Dispatch since we've been online. But the number of people that aren't in Central Ohio who are looking at what we're writing because we can put it out there so fast on Twitter is good for our business. And we know, you know, we're trying to figure out how to do this properly and figure out what the rules should be. But I think we're heading in the right direction, and I think it helps us.
So given the cautionary, you know, obviously the cautionary tales, and I think, you know, I think the message is basically the candidates have always tried to spin the media in one way or another. It's just we've never had to react as quickly as we have to now and be smart and make decisions about what we do. So how, and to be honest, I mean, would we have been, we've only talked about Twitter, we didn't even talk about Facebook and what, which is a huge, I think, shows you how Twitter has really increased in terms of prominence as a tool for them and for us since even 2008, when I guess Obama really kind of created that as a key platform. So how do you inform your use of Twitter and other social